HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Forgiveness is a Choice, a step-by-step process for resolving anger and restoring hope, by Robert D. Enright, Ph.D., read by Kevin T. Collins. Part 1. Forgiveness is a Choice. Chapter 1. Forgiveness, a Path to Freedom. Mary Ann, a 38-year-old mother of 3 children who suffered a turbulent marriage, sat in a tiny office staring across the desk at the unsmiling counselor. Dr. Malachi had come highly recommended, one of the best counselors in the community. She had waited a month for this appointment and driven over an hour to the office hidden in the woods of western Connecticut to ask his advice. She wanted to vent her frustrations about her mother. At the same time, she was trying to save her marriage, protect her children, and drag herself out of a hole of despondency. She had expected comfort and consolation, which she received, but Mary Ann was not ready for this question near the session's end. Have you considered the possibility of forgiving your mother? That was impossible. She went through it all again, how night after night her mother had made her endure hours of biting criticism and punished her if she answered back or even had a sassy look on her face, how every birthday and every holiday had culminated in a knock-down, drag-out fight, how even after she had married and moved away, every visit had ended in a shouting match, and how finally her mother and her husband, Brendan, had gotten into a drunken brawl while she was in the hospital having her 3rd baby. Dr. Malachi listened and said sympathetically, "It may seem like too much right now, but I would like you to consider the various options open to you regarding your mother. Forgiveness may be one of those options." Mary Ann had not come to Dr. Malachi to hear that. The bout between her husband and mother had severed their relationship, and frankly, she was relieved, wasn't she? Yet recently she had been feeling guilty. Will she ever have a relationship with her mother again? She hoped that the counselor would assure her that severing the relationship was a good idea. She definitely had not expected to consider forgiveness. Waves of anger and fear swept over her. How could she possibly forgive? Dr. Malachi ended with, "It's your decision. Let's meet again next week." 4 weeks and 4 sessions followed, with Mary Ann alternating among anger, ambivalence, and confusion at the idea of forgiveness. In the 5th session, without feeling or conviction, through clenched teeth and as a simple act of the will, she said to the counselor, "I forgive my mother." With that, she began a journey into freedom. Mary Ann had no idea what to expect. She didn't have any guideposts. She stumbled along with the help of the therapist, discovering that forgiveness was far deeper, far richer than she had imagined. Looking back, she realizes that her statement, "I forgive my mother," was merely the first step, in many ways no more than an intention to begin the process of forgiveness. It would take time before that process was complete, and for Mary Ann, as for most of us, the work of forgiveness is ongoing. What Mary Ann did not know at the time was how much her decision to forgive would change her life for the better. When Mary Ann went to Dr. Malachi, the problem she brought to the table was only the tip of the iceberg. Although she didn't realize it, Mary Ann was suffering from depression. Her husband, Brendan, had a serious drinking problem. After work, he would stop at the local tavern, rarely making it home before midnight. She was left alone with 3 small children. She spent her days escaping into fantasy or watching TV, her nights in rage watching the clock. Hopelessness and anger drained her energy. She neglected the children and then turned on them with harsh words when they misbehaved. When she begged her husband to come home earlier or to help with the children, he accused her of being a bad wife and mother. Their fights were in many ways replays of the confrontations between Mary Ann and her mother. Mary Ann was being pulled down into a whirlpool of resentment and self-pity from which there seemed no escape. Some nights she sat for hours on the staircase, looking out the window down the road leading to town, watching for Brendan's car and thinking, "Why is he doing this to me?" She would alternate between rage at Brendan and self-recrimination. Tomorrow I'll change. Tomorrow I'll pull myself together. But then her anger would return, and she'd remember the times when she had cleaned the house and cooked a beautiful dinner, and Brendan hadn't come home. Eventually Brendan would arrive, too drunk to stand up, and Mary Ann would swallow her anger and put him to bed. In the morning he would be too hungover to endure conversation, and she would be too exhausted to cope with 3 recalcitrant children. She would leave them to their own devices, and then scream at them because they had made a mess or had gotten into a fight. And so it went. Occasionally Mary Ann blew up. She and Brendan would have a real fight, and he would walk out. Mary Ann, terrified, would back down and apologize. Not only was Mary Ann's life a disaster, but also she was afraid that if things proceeded on this track, the pattern would be repeated in the next generation. Forgiveness is a Choice is a self-help book for people like Mary Ann who are caught in a vortex of anger, resentment, and seemingly endless destructive patterns, and who are looking for a way out. In 1985, the Human Development Study Group at the University of Wisconsin-Madison began an intensive investigation into forgiveness. I was part of that group, and this book is a product of our investigation. Our work was so fruitful that in 1994 we expanded our group and founded the International Forgiveness Institute, a non-profit organization that helps people understand forgiveness so they can make their own decisions about the topic. In the following, you will be introduced to a scientifically tested program for forgiveness. Its purpose is to benefit you, the forgiver. If you are willing to use the forgiveness process, I believe that you may be able to find freedom from anger, resentment, bitterness, and the self-destructive behavior patterns that accompany them. You may have inherited a family tradition of anger and bitterness, but you don't have to pass it on to your children and grandchildren. I can't, of course, promise that the forgiveness process will work for every person and every problem. Such a claim would be absurd. There are no panaceas, but I have seen amazing changes in people's lives. Martha had not seen her grandchildren in years because of a rift with her daughter-in-law Agnes. Finally, Martha swallowed her pride, picked up the telephone, forgave Agnes, and reconciled with her. She was then able to resume a joyous relationship with her grandchildren. Gary's constant travel in his job led to a separation from his wife Barbara until they both realized that bitterness had destroyed the family. Forgiveness and the building of trust restored the relationship and the family. Alexandra was pursuing a college degree until she had a serious argument with an instructor over a grade. She was so aggravated at the teacher that she dropped out of school. Only upon struggling to forgive was she able to return to school and pursue her dreams, instead of pursuing her rage. Our research group has conducted scientific tests using forgiveness as a form of therapy and education. We have researched the world's great religious traditions, read works of philosophy, and held discussions with therapists and counselors. Our work is by no means completed, but after 15 years of research, I feel that we have found sufficient evidence of the power of forgiveness so that I can offer our knowledge to those who want to be free from the bondage of anger and resentment. If the prospect of forgiving those who have injured you is as terrifying to you as it was to Mary Ann, this book will serve as a guide to light your way through that fear to a place of peace and relief. I will try to answer your questions and help you through the phases of the forgiveness process. One of the questions I am most frequently asked is, how did you begin studying forgiveness in the first place? I am almost embarrassed to say that my interest was not the result of some incredible childhood trauma or a tragic relationship in adulthood, but instead grew out of my deep curiosity about the wisdom of the ages. People almost expect that if you dedicate your life to the study of forgiveness, then of course you were probably chained to a basement wall for a while during those formative years, or at least you married the world's most insensitive partner. I am happy to say that none of this is true in my own case, people's expectations notwithstanding. I came to study, write about, and speak about forgiveness because I grew enormously dissatisfied with my own area of research, moral development. Those in university settings asking the questions about morals were not exciting the general public as far as I could see, and they were not asking the kinds of questions that might change people's lives. I thought that forgiveness, as one aspect of moral development, just might change people's lives for the good. My many years exploring how people forgive and the results obtained after people forgave have not disappointed me. In fact, I am more impressed today with the power of forgiveness than when I first began. It is a bit ironic that, since beginning the scientific study of forgiveness, I've had to practice the art of forgiveness far more than before. Many of my colleagues in the social sciences, quite frankly, thought that I had lost my mind studying such a soft or inappropriate topic as forgiveness. Leave the examination of forgiveness to the clergy, I was told. You'll never get a job working in academia if you stick with Enright, my graduate students were counseled. This topic has nothing to do with social science, I heard whispered more than once. I've battled through misunderstanding, indifference, and anger from others as I've tried to bring some perspective and depth to the questions, what is forgiveness? How do people go about forgiving? What happens when people forgive? Yes, those who've criticized me and what I study at times have made me angry. Encountering a growing anger led me to the need to forgive. I also know from experience that forgiving is not for wimps, but is instead hard work. Yet, as you stick with it, forgiveness offers untold rewards. Are you angry? Had they been asked, Mary Ann's acquaintances probably would not have picked the word angry to describe her. Most people saw her as vaguely out of it or eccentric. Her anger at her mother manifested itself by a rebellion against every social convention. Her rage at her husband Brendan was concealed with rationalizations about his poor health and business obligations. Her verbal attacks on her children never took place in public. She never mentioned Brendan's excessive drinking, and because their social friends were his friends, drinking to excess as he did, no one ever suggested that Brendan was an alcoholic. Occasionally, Marianne would pour out her pain to a friend, and she had on several occasions sought counseling, but nothing had come of it. Everyone agreed that she had been mistreated, but none of the good advice she had received had really addressed her problem. The black clouds of long-standing resentments could not be dispelled by a decision to cheer up or just don't think about it, or even by the insight that what happened to her was unfair. There must be more. The first step in forgiving is recognizing that you are angry, and surprisingly, for some people, this may be the hardest step. Marianne knew that she was angry at her mother. She believed that her anger was completely justified. On the other hand, she felt guilty for being angry at her husband and vacillated between blaming herself and blaming him. She refused to admit that she was angry with her children because she rightly believed that being angry at small children was irrational. Marianne would eventually have to face the full extent of her anger. Are you looking for conditional forgiveness? Some people are willing to forgive only if they can be assured that the people they forgive will change. Marianne would have been happy to forgive mother, husband, children, everyone, if only they would come to her on bended knee, begging for her forgiveness and promising to never hurt her again. She did not think that she wanted revenge. She just wanted everyone to change. She would learn that the first person that forgiveness changes is the person doing the forgiving. Very often, those trapped in an abusive situation are afraid to forgive, especially if they have given the abuser forgiveness in the past, only to have the abuser respond with more abuse. Marianne feared that forgiving her mother would require her to allow her mother's continued abuse. She would learn that forgiving gives her the freedom to deal with her mother without internalizing her mother's anger. Many people confuse forgiveness with trust. They are not the same. In the following chapters, we will discuss how going through the forgiveness process does not require accepting continued abuse, and, in fact, helps people learn how to remove themselves from abusive situations. Forgiveness is not a bargain or negotiation. Forgiveness is not a magic trick that allows us to control other people. A wife cannot say, "I will forgive my husband, and then he must change." Forgiveness is a risk, because we don't always know what the results of our forgiveness will be. Sometimes the person we forgive is transformed. Sometimes there is no change. Sometimes the forgiver is changed and discovers that the offenses that seemed so terrible are easily tolerated. Other times, forgiveness gives forgivers the courage to extricate themselves from a destructive relationship. For those of you who are in a codependent relationship, forgiveness is often an essential step in the process of healing. Marianne had cut her mother out of her life, but anger toward her mother still controlled her. Resentments and anger don't just disappear. An angry woman can divorce her husband. She can take the children, withdraw every penny of the joint assets, leave town, marry again, and start a new life. But if she doesn't forgive, she may suffer recurring resentment-related problems, and her children may be infected by recurring resentments, which will affect their future relationships and emotional life for decades. I have seen men and women in their 80s who are still angry over injustices they endured as children. Although their childhood tormentors are long dead, they still see themselves as victims. The therapist, Judith Wallerstein, interviewed family members decades after divorce and found that they were still suffering from the emotional pain related to the divorce. Incredibly, 1/2 of the women and 1/3 of the men are still intensely angry at their former spouses, despite the passage of 10 or more years. Because their feelings have not changed, anger has become an ongoing and sometimes dominant presence in their children's lives as well. Forgiveness is a process. Professor of Theology Lewis Smedes, long an observer of the forgiveness process, puts a few qualifiers on the benefits I discuss here. He cautions that forgiveness is for imperfect people, those of us who are not necessarily the saints of the world. We less than saintly types sometimes find that the release from resentment is less than complete months or even years after we forgave. Sometimes we awaken with a sense of anger that surprises, especially when we thought that our bitterness was on a speeding train south. Sometimes we get discouraged about the injustices that we experienced in our distant past. Forgiveness is a process. Our research group discovered that simply saying, "I forgive you," is usually not enough. Although the words are said, the angry feelings often return. People need to go through a process to understand their feelings. They also need to take concrete action. Sometimes forgiveness involves facing not a single incident, but a long series of hurts. Sometimes we forgive one person, only to discover that there are others whom we need to forgive. Mary Ann began by forgiving her mother, but later realized that she also had to forgive her father. She recognized her need to forgive her husband, but found it difficult to face her anger toward her children, certainly not for the times they acted up when she was neglecting them, but for the times when they truly were unruly. Indeed, as she worked through the process of forgiveness, she discovered that the list of people against whom she held resentment was long, and it was easy to add new names to the list. Many people have shared their stories with us. Except in cases where the story has already been published, we have changed the names and the details because each has a right to privacy. Those who have walked its path are the best witnesses of the benefits of forgiveness. They admit that forgiveness does not remove all the pain, but that after forgiveness, the remaining pain is bearable. After forgiving, they realized that anger and bitterness had made bad situations worse. Through anecdotal evidence and scientific studies on forgiveness, by comparing groups who were instructed in forgiveness with groups who were not, we believe that we have found substantial and credible evidence that forgiveness produces benefits for those who forgive. We are not alone in our assessment of the benefits to forgiveness. Consider a few observations by therapists who work with people on forgiving others. Therapists observe the benefits of choosing to forgive. Therapists are in an excellent position to observe the forgiveness process. Their reports provide documentary evidence of the benefits of forgiveness and how the process works. When working with a client who wishes to forgive, the therapist is able to track the process and observe the effects. The therapist can observe changes in the client's mood, physical well-being, basic outlook on life, relationships, and work habits. Not everyone who is experiencing anger and resentment seeks the help of a therapist or even needs to. Anger doesn't necessarily drive you to utter distraction, but it can cause psychological problems and exacerbate existing ones. Some very angry people are able to lead reasonably normal lives. Some are able to compartmentalize their anger or push their feelings out of sight. American society allows people to manifest a substantial amount of anger. Not forgiving is socially acceptable. Talk shows are full of people exhibiting pathological levels of anger who are treated as though their rages were completely normal and acceptable. On the other hand, some people with serious psychological and emotional problems are extremely angry and resentful. Their problems provoke mistreatment, their psychological condition causes them to misinterpret the motives and actions of others, and their mental condition robs them of the ability to deal with their anger. Their anger needs to be taken seriously. Although forgiving won't cure psychosis, many therapists report that even clients with serious psychological problems often benefit from forgiving. R.C. Hunter, a Canadian psychiatrist, was one of the first therapists to report on the benefits of forgiveness. He reported that people who have a wide variety of psychological symptoms can experience healing through forgiving. He found that those who are anxious can experience an increased inner peace through forgiveness. Those who are depressed, intensely angry, or even paranoid have shown a significant reduction in their symptoms. Dr. Hunter observed significant improvement in clients who forgave. Their feelings of bitterness and resentment toward people who had hurt them were reduced. He reported on a 25-year-old woman, let's call her Harriet, with acute emotional distress, who was excessively demanding and tended to lash out at others when she was angry. She seemed to create barriers between herself and others, which trapped her in a kind of agitated loneliness. She had few friends and still lived at home, and her relationship with her parents was quite strained. In therapy, Harriet learned that her mother was a captive of her own anger, condemning her daughter for the slightest deviation from her unreasonable standards. Growing up with condemnation, Harriet learned to condemn. Her anger toward her own mother turned Harriet into a highly critical, caustic person with symptoms of anxiety and depression. Having been on the receiving end of unjust criticism, she learned how to dish out unjust criticism and was now giving better than she had been given. By examining her mother's background, Harriet was able to see that her mother, like everyone else, is inevitably caught up in the effects of their experiences and possessed both good and bad qualities. She was able to see that she, too, was a product, at least in part, of family upbringing, and that she was capable, like everyone else, of both positive and negative behavior. With Dr. Hunter's help, Harriet came to understand how she had reacted to her own victimization by victimizing others. When she was ready to forgive both parents for their failings, she did so, according to the psychiatrist, with tenderness and some ruefulness. Forgiving allowed Harriet to see that she was responsible for her own behavior. She didn't have to criticize and belittle others. Once she had forgiven her parents, she experienced greater self-acceptance and was able to establish meaningful friendships. She learned how to express and receive love. Shortly after her therapy ended, she married. Harriet's transformation required two important steps. First, a readiness to forgive, and second, an openness to love. Morton Kaufman, an Israeli psychiatrist, found that genuine acts of forgiveness lead to an overall improvement in a person's emotional maturity. Dr. Kaufman believes that as one forgives, one grows as a person capable of courage, nurturance of others, and love. In one of Dr. Kaufman's case studies, Yuri, an Army officer in his 40s, came to therapy because of his inability to establish positive relationships with women. Through therapy, Yuri realized how much he hated his father, who died when he was young, and his mother, whom he blamed for the family's subsequent poverty. His anger was the cause of his intense anxiety and poor relationships with women. Yuri had...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?